Hey, Ian, could you stop sharing screen?
Yep. There you go.
Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and action on all things to do with sustainability. With me in Sydney today, Nigel Lake here, and my co-host Paul Herman, who is somewhere in France, and he will let us know where a little bit later on. We have a really interesting discussion coming up today about the outcomes from COP27, and indeed we will probably touch on COP15, and we will also have our Green Jobs Report. We're joined by Lina Constantinovici and Ian Monroe, who bring different perspectives around what is going on. And I think as we approach this, we're very mindful that there has been lots of, I think, a lot of frustrating things that we've seen happen or not happen, and we're also looking for where are the positives in all of this. If you're joining us in our live audience on Zoom, welcome. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat. It's great to know who you are, where you are, what you're interested in, and we will try to address that. If you have questions as we go through, post them in the Q&A, and we will work them into the discussion as best we can. If you're with us on social media, thank you very much. Please do use the like button. It amplifies our message, gets it out to the important message of all of our guests to a much wider audience. Every single use of the like button adds at least 10 more views, possibly more. So thank you in advance for that. Just as a very brief introduction before we get to the Green Jobs Report, the quick reminder that all of this focus on environment and more broadly climate change, agriculture, etc., started over 50 years ago in 1972 with limits to growth, the formation of the UN Environment Programme, and it feels like an enormously long time has gone past with not necessarily enough happening. Of course, you'll all have seen the news articles from 100 years ago when people were talking about this, and my favourite statistic, which was that Joseph Fourier wrote a paper explaining how carbon dioxide and the composition of the atmosphere could change the temperature of the planet in the 1830s, which is rather crazy. We understand the problem in that we understand what climate change is, what is causing it. We understand what we need to do, which is decarbonize the grid, decarbonize all forms of transport, including shipping and planes. But there are still many barriers to change. We understand those too, which are typically the structures within which everything takes place, the fact that the voices of the status quo and of the past and of the problems we're trying to address are louder and better funded than the voices of the future. And I think we will be touching on that too. And of course, some things just take time, and time was on our side 50 years ago. It is no longer on our side today. So with that as introduction, and with the other point, a good friend of mine who's been involved in these processes for ages was so upset during the COP in Sharm el Sheikh, they actually cried on stage for the first time. So this kind of emotional sensitivity and tension that's going on, let's try to keep a positive frame of mind as we go through into exploring what can be done and where we go now. But before that, the practical reminder as to what is already happening in the world of green jobs. Let me hand over to Paul Herman and Amir Khalegi and Fidel Kaboub to take us into our Green Jobs Report. Thank you, guys.
That's great. Thank you, Nigel, for the intro. Nick, our producer, it still says we're in a practice session. So if there's something that says go live, if you could hit that, please. It is streaming on YouTube. So welcome to ESGX. Delighted to have you with us. We're delighted that Lina Constantinovici and Ian Monroe are here to talk about COP27 and on the ground. as a preview to that, since COP27 is about green jobs, Amir is going to give us a short presentation on the state of green jobs in the US and some research from the World Resources Institute. And then in less than 10 minutes, Lina and Ian will be on the stage, and we're going to hear directly from them being in Egypt at COP27 and possibly previous reports from earlier COPs. All right, Amir, over to you. Give us the latest on green jobs and how that is leading to more or less climate action.
Thank you, Paul. Really excited for this week's discussion and excited to present to you all this monthly Green Jobs Report. So for those, our analysis provides data-driven insights on greening the economy, and our analysis begins by rating over 2,000 HIP-rated companies with a human impact plus profit rating. This human impact plus profit rating is based on 7 HIP pillars, specifically health, wealth, earth, equality, trust, products and services, and management practices. Once these companies are rated, they are then cross-mapped to industry data provided by the Current Employment Statistics Survey that provides specifically data on employment and wages. Then, once cross-mapped using the North American Industry Classification System, we then are able to provide a weighted industry HIP rating based on the industry's HIP rating proportional to their employment. Some example green industries are listed below: recycling services, cleaning manufacturers, examples of slightly extractive industries, and extractive industries such as oil and gas extraction and casinos. In total, we analyze over 190 industries, which constitute around 89% of the total employment. What we continually find is that jobs in greener industries have been the most resilient and recovered fastest during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we can see here that on the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic during April, that proportionally green jobs suffered the lowest job loss in comparison to extractive industries and slightly extractive industries. They were also the first to recover past their February 2020 employment level relative to all other buckets. But since then, we have seen a lower slope in the job gain in comparison to slightly extractive and extractive industries, indicating that instead of taking the opportunity to build back better, we're actually building back towards more extractive industries, despite greener industries showing more resiliency and building back faster to its pre-pandemic level. So this is indicated here, as we can see of the rating of the hipness of the economy. As our unemployment becomes lower and we're gaining more jobs, unfortunately, the hipness of the economy is also slipping, indicating that we are building back to more slightly extractive and extractive industries, as opposed to taking the opportunity to not only invest in more resilient jobs, but also higher paying jobs. So another one of our insights is that greener industries on average are the highest paying on an annual and hourly basis. Not only on an hourly basis, they provide the most consistent hours in comparison to slightly extractive and extractive industries. And we can see here that there is a large difference between the annualized pay of a green industry versus slightly extractive, and especially when it comes to extractive industries. Part of this, again, is driven by the stability of green employment and providing more weekly hours in comparison to part-time or contractual work that is, or seasonal work that is found in slightly extractive and extractive industries. Over the past 10 years, we've seen that slightly extractive and extractive industries were on the same growth rate in terms of wage up until January 2020. But post-pandemic, we saw the highest year over year wage growth in greener industries. And just looking at the wage growth since January 2010, the highest wage growth is seen with 58.5% in green industries, while extractive industry wages have lagged behind with an average of 43.7% growth, hourly growth. But interestingly, as well, one more slide, green jobs are also the most resilient to job loss. Another indication of this is looking at the unemployment by industry greenness. Looking here at the CPS data, a slight difference from the CES data because the CPS data is provided at a household level as opposed to the firm level. But because it's provided at a household level, we actually get the data back faster. Therefore, the most recent numbers for this show that green industries have a 1.5% unemployment rate compared to slightly extractive with 3.7 and extractive industries with a 5.1% unemployment rate. So Paul had mentioned earlier that we had discovered a working paper from October 2021 that was released by the World Resources Institute, and it found many insights and conclusions from their analysis that are aligned with the analysis that we have been providing for over 2 years at this point. The difference between their research is that it looked at green investments that are used to create jobs, and they found that greener investments within industries created more proportional near-term jobs when comparing to unsustainable investments such as oil and gas, fossil fuels, or in this case, road construction, or moving away from greener public transit. But we can see here from these findings, looking at this table here, if we're looking at this median ratio across the literature review that they had done, when looking at investment dollars, when investing in sustainable industries, the proportional job creation was at times significantly more than as compared to fossil fuels. So if we're looking at industries within solar energy, they found that investing 1 million in solar energy created 1.5 times as many jobs when compared to fossil fuels. So as a hypothetical example, if $1 million in solar energy investments created 150 jobs, that same $1 million investment in the fossil fuel industry would only create 100 jobs. So it seems like a no-brainer to be investing in these greener industries based on our analysis for the over 2 years at this point, tracking it since the pandemic, seeing how they're more resilient, pay better, have better job quality in terms of safety, in terms of education, in terms of repurposing, in terms of accessibility to marginalized communities and not being geography locked. Also, another thing is that looking at their additional insights is that greener jobs are actually more labor intensive and require more human inputs as opposed to fossil fuel industries, which are more automated and base their investments on capital inputs, getting machinery, getting land, getting buildings to ultimately automate the process. But with greener jobs, it's more sustainable employment. And not only that, it's not as subject to the volatility in production cycles as is with oil and gas extractions. And the research found that clean energy is jobs in clean energy are normally and generally steadier. Another interesting finding from their research working paper, and the final one I will touch upon, is that they found that median hourly wages of clean energy workers were 25% higher than those of workers overall. Another insight that we have consistently found over these past 2 years.
Great. Well, Amir, thanks very much for sharing both this research paper from the World Resources Institute and the monthly Green Jobs Insights. And so we all aspire to build back better, yet we seem to be building back the same. So let's transition to our discussion about what happened at COP27. And Amir, thanks very much for this deep dive
Thank you.
analysis. And welcome Lina Constantinovici, who's the founder of Innovation 4.4, which Lina can explain, and Ian Monroe, who's a founder of Etho Capital and also a lecturer at Stanford University. So both Lina and Ian were on the ground in Egypt at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Lina's going to give us a little overview of the lay of the land of what's it like to go to COP, and feel free to bring in previous experiences and previous COPs, both Lina and Ian. And then if you have questions, please ask them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll moderate them. So let's dig in. We got, plenty of ground to cover, including, is this a success or is this a failure? So Lina, take us back a couple weeks ago to Egypt and give us the lay of the land.
Sure, happy to do so. Thank you for having me. Great to be here with you all today. A little bit of a background as to the connection between our organization and UNFCCC and the COPs and why we were there to begin with. Innovation 4.4 has the mission to accelerate the deployment of solutions most relevant to the Paris Agreement and the UN SDGs. So we have had a longstanding relationship with the UN in multiple ways. Last year in Glasgow, we were an official partner to UNFCCC, which meant we were invited to have an innovation exhibit featuring solutions to some of the challenges that were being talked about in the negotiations and beyond. And we had about 70 or 80 ministers of environment come through, regional development banks, and many others. We also are a partner to the United Nations Association, the San Francisco chapter. We were a contributor to the V20 report. And this year was a particularly fruitful COP for us as an organization. We are in the midst of negotiating a partnership, a collaboration with the Africa Adaptation Initiative, which is 54 African countries. And the mission and mandate of the organization is solutions deployment. We also have a collaboration with Kenya, the government of Kenya directly. Just before COP, they announced 8 billion in 8 billion trees, reforestation projects that we are collaborating on. So just to provide a little bit of context as to why we were there to begin with. The way that COP is structured, there is a blue zone, which is the official area where the negotiations happen, and also where the official country pavilions and some private sector pavilions are located. In addition to the blue zone that requires accreditation, i.e. either those who are negotiating, who have negotiator status, or NGOs that are observers, or about 13 categories of participants that are invited into the blue zone. In addition to the blue zone, there's a green zone that's really more for public sector, for the public to engage with COP. It does not require the level of accreditation. The blue zone does. Many NGOs exhibit and provide content and so on various themes related to COP. The new area this year was called the Innovation Zone, and there was a climate action stage with great programming with everyone from Mary Robinson to many other distinguished participants, and a variety of topics from climate to plastics to all sorts of related topics. So that was a new format this year, the Innovation Zone, and I'm guessing it will continue. It was successful by my observation, so it is likely to continue. The main theme this year was loss and damage. Why was this a theme that took up so much attention and priority this year? 23 developed nations that are part of the Annex 2 of the United Nations Climate Convention represent 12% of the global population and over half of emissions. So this is one of the reasons why countries that have not been the key emitters, but are feeling the consequences of emissions from developed countries, have been asking for loss and damage funding to be able to provide solutions for the impacts of climate change. In 2009, developed countries have promised loss and damage compensation at 100 billion per year. That has not happened. So this is why loss and damage has come to the forefront. There's a new fund that was launched this year. About 300 million in commitments were made, not nearly the amount needed or even promised. And some of the research from UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, is showing that actually we need 1 to 2 trillion per year rather than 100 billion. So I'll leave it at that for now, but that's a little bit of the context for some of the key conversations around loss and damage. And this is in the official negotiations in the blue zone. There are many other conversations and commitments by the private sector that happened outside the blue zone in the many other related events that were in Sharm el-Sheikh that took place outside of the blue zone. So I'll leave it there for now and turn it over to Ian to share some of his impressions, and then I've got a bunch of other fun facts that I'm happy to share if there's time.
Yeah, we would definitely want to get into it, and the details from the micro to the macro. All right, Ian, you were in Egypt. How long were you there? Was this your first COP? Was it bigger, smaller, more exciting, less exciting?
Yeah, thanks a lot for setting the stage, Lina, and just giving the background and the loss and damage development out of COP, I'd say, is really big. So return to that in a moment. So just for background for everyone, Ian Monroe, I have a few hats. For over a decade, I've been teaching courses on solving climate change at Stanford University and just co-authored actually a textbook called Solving Climate Change, primarily for university students, but also for investors and philanthropists and folks in the government and nonprofit spaces interested in climate solutions. So just put up a link to that. But what brought me to COP was a mix of the academic side and then the climate investing side. So I was officially at COP in the blue zone as part of the Stanford University delegation with the academic hat on. But really what convinced me it was worth the time to come to Egypt was coming out of the Etho Capital side of what I do, which is focused on investing in climate solutions and climate solutions applied to the public equity investing space in particular. We've been part of this much larger movement called the Climate Positive Investing Alliance, or CPIA, which Paul and HIP Investor is a co-founding member, as well as Lina and Innovation 4.4, and a growing global network really trying to push investors to align where the money is flowing with what climate science actually says is necessary, which at this rate is really much faster than net zero by 2050, which was the trend that really got going in a big way last COP in Glasgow. But at this rate, that's what the science said about 20 years ago. The science now is really saying we need net zero by 2040 as a planet, and investors need to move much faster than that. So that's the main message I was pushing at COP, alongside this broader growth of the Climate Positive Investing Alliance and these higher standards for climate investing. So in answer to Paul's question, this isn't my first COP, but it actually kind of surprisingly is only my second. My first COP actually was Paris, which the Paris Agreement came out of. So it was, in that case, a COP that was really connected. The blue zone and the green zone were right next to each other. So civil society and business very much connected, with the direct negotiations going on and lots of protests, lots of civil society engagement, very, very well organized and run. And then Egypt, on the other hand, many have said was the worst organized COP that they've ever been to in close to 30 years of COPs now. Everything was super spread out. The green zone, where civil society primarily was located, was pushed off to this chunk of desert that you had to take a separate bus to get to. The innovation zone, which officially was open to the public, but even that you had to get accreditation and be approved to be there. That was also far enough away from the main blue zone COP negotiations that you had to take a separate shuttle to get there. So everything was very spread out at this COP relative to what it's been before. And there was a lot of critique of the Egyptian government and its organizing, even Guardian articles and other things published about potentially the official COP app that the Egyptian government put out there being filled with spyware and trying to track people, and definitely a whole lot of massive security, very little in the way of protests, civil society engagement. Sharm el-Sheikh, the Egyptian resort where COP27 took place, even is a walled city where you have to go through checkpoints just to get into the city. And so it kind of, in many ways, was the opposite of my one other COP experience. It was very spread out, very high security, very kind of cut off from civil society and public engagement. And a lot of this was to be expected. And so, frankly, a lot of folks didn't have much in the way of expectations that a lot was going to come out of this COP, which actually makes it that much more remarkable that the loss and damage agreement really did come out of this COP, because that's something that has been pushed for now more than 30 years. And finally, mainly because the US has finally dropped opposition and the EU has really pushed for more loss and damage compensation, there's been this agreement to actually move forward, create a loss and damage fund. It's very much to be determined who's going to put in money, how much is going to be put in, what sort of crazy bureaucratic hoops are going to be put in place that need to be jumped through before any of that money really gets distributed. But it is a great initial start. The thing that still did not happen at this COP, which I think is really going to be one of the big fights, or the big fight moving forward, is still any official recognition that to solve climate change, we need to effectively stop using all fossil fuels, which is what science has been saying for decades now. It's what all the models around climate solutions that the UN puts out say. One way or another, basically all coal, oil, and gas need to go effectively to zero, with carbon removal beyond that to actually solve climate, hit any climate target, whether it's 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or something better than 1.5 degrees. Yet in the COP official negotiations, still we didn't get any wording saying that we needed to phase out fossil fuels. And that was a big fight, along with the loss and damage that got lost and will continue over into the next COP negotiations. And of course, the next COP will be in Dubai, in the heart of the oil and gas industry. So they're very much at the COP in Egypt already. There was a whole lot of oil and gas influence there. There are even these giant domes sponsored by Saudi Arabia that were literally big green domes, the Saudi green zone, where they were promoting Saudi Arabia's somehow a solution to climate change without any plan to produce less oil and gas as part of their equations. So there certainly was interesting cognitive dissonance and, greenwashing alongside the real progress that happened at COP. But with all that said, there was real progress made at this COP that, at least on the loss and damage front, really exceeded a lot of people's expectations. So I'm happy to dive into the details of the net zero by 2040 stuff and what we're doing more with the Climate Positive Investing Alliance and get into specific vignettes. But with that, I think should turn it into more of a dialogue, get into questions, and I guess I'll hand it back to you, Paul, and whoever in the audience wants to dive in.
Great. Well, we have questions, of course. Nigel, is there a question you want to kick it off with? You're on mute. Okay, Nigel will be back in a second. Fadil, is there
If I can add just to follow up on what Ian just said, if I can add just a couple things, is that okay?
Sure, go for it.
So there were many interesting negotiations around language to be included in the loss and damage conversations and some of the other conversations. So, for example, the phrase major emitters was highly contested and had to be taken out and replaced. And so a lot of the language was a lot of the negotiations were around language, and there's pages and pages written about this. I highly recommend digging into that if you're interested. One of the interesting statements, Mia Mottley, who's the Prime Minister of Barbados, called for a 10% windfall tax on oil and gas companies, and pointed out that if implemented at the beginning of 2022, by the end of this year, that alone would have generated 31 billion in climate finance. So that's about 1/3 of the 100 billion promised but not committed. So interesting fact.
Absolutely, and that was the question I was going to ask if I had not had my sound problem, which was precisely there was this climate finance fund created, which very little money has been put into. Almost all the money, if I understand correctly, actually is just loans, possibly on favourable terms, possibly not. So this is still extractive development, and I can hear Fidel getting ready to dive into that question in any second. And so my concern is, we have this new loss and damage fund, which is very important, which is a beautiful new shiny thing not to be funded for a long period of time, to go with the other thing not to be funded, when at the same time we still subsidize fossil fuels hand over fist in many countries around the world. And so I'm interested to hear Fidel's comments on that. And just as a kind of brighter light to that, despite all of that, there are places, and I'm down here in Australia for a couple of weeks, where significant amounts of money are being invested in renewables. We've got 3 gigawatts of projects that we're working on right now ourselves in our business, which is, it's a decent amount of power. So there is this activity taking place. Capital is being deployed. But this is in a rich part of the world where there's plenty of money and plenty of customers. Very different challenge from much of the lower income nations who desperately need the support of the climate finance proposals to be able to act themselves. So maybe Fidel would have some very interesting comments on all of that.
Thank you, Nigel and Paul and Lina and Ian. Thank you so much for kicking off the conversation with really pressing all the hot buttons that need to be pressed and need to be addressed. And you mentioned Mia Mottley, who's, if I had any power and influence in this world, I would name her the Tsar of climate action. But as you know, the most powerful nation at the COP, if it was a nation in terms of representation by delegates, is the fossil fuel industry. Which is a problem, right? But I wanted to share this screen here and show you just this one picture, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but our audience would appreciate looking at this graph from the United Nations Environmental Program. Produced this report a couple of years ago called the Production Gap, and the gap between the level of fossil fuel extraction that is being planned for 2030, 2040 versus the level that we're actually allowed to extract and burn if we're going to meet the climate challenge. And we're on track to produce and burn almost double the amount by 2030 and almost 4 times the amount by 2040. So this gap needs to be closed. And the only way to close it is by rapidly phasing out fossil fuels and ending the construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure, starting with coal and then adding oil and gas very, very rapidly, which means we need the entire world to sit down and negotiate a fossil fuels non-proliferation treaty. And just like we negotiated the nuclear weapons non-proliferation treaty back in the day. So this is the thing that needs to be front and center in order for us to actually make progress, and then figuring out how do we do this? How do we end fossil fuels with a just transition, not just with empty words, but just transition for workers in the fossil fuel industry around the world, for countries, especially in the global south, that depend heavily on fossil fuel to run their economies, but also depend heavily on fossil fuels to in terms of being major exporters of fossil fuels. So we have to face these challenges. In terms of decarbonizing the global economy, we also have to be very honest about the feasibility, the technical feasibility. So let's say we eliminate all of these potential stranded assets and we move forward with, solar and wind and all the wonderful new technologies that are available to us. The numbers just don't add up in terms of this global obsession with economic growth for its own sake, which means we have to recognize that the global north needs to grow differently and needs to give up the concept of growth as measured by GDP and needs to decouple quality of life from GDP growth. And all of this has been available in terms of research and engagement from the climate action community from the 1960s and 70s, but especially to today. And yet this is something that the global north is not willing to contemplate. And at some point, we have to face that reality. Because if we're going to use the raw materials available on the planet, mostly in the global south, to actually invest heavily in decarbonizing by building renewable solar and wind and so on, the numbers don't add up, meaning we don't actually have enough to fully decarbonize the global north at the current pace of consumption and consumerism and growth, and to also provide the renewable energy infrastructure needed, say, for the 600 million Africans today who don't have any access to electricity to begin with. So we have to face these issues. And finally, I'll just add one follow-up comment to an agreement with what Lina said earlier in terms of this, the commitment from 2009 to put $100 billion in these funds. And today we have yet another fund that remains empty until we figure out how to fill it. What's so insulting about the history of these commitments and empty promises is the fact that it sounds like a step forward. I'm giving you $100 billion, or I promise to give you 100, and then it turns out I'm only giving you 10 or even less. But what's missing from that equation is the fact that today the global north as a whole, as a block, extracts $2 trillion a year from the global south. So if I promise to give you 100, but I'm taking 2 trillion from you, it's actually insulting. and it's not going to move us in the right direction. So we need to rethink all of these parameters front and center, at the center of the COP agenda, as opposed to cherry picking the agenda items that will produce a nice statement at the end and a little bit of hope, and then going back to square one in terms of nothing actually moving on the rapid pace that is actually needed in the next decade or less to actually put a dent in these problems.
And Nigel, you mentioned loans versus grants. I think one of the outcries from less developed nations has been over this allocation of loans versus grants, because they're already drowning in loans. And so structuring this financing as loans is really not helpful to them. So there are many disparities that came to light in these negotiations between how the global north thinks about financing. Also, I think it was Kerry even called for private financing to play a larger role. And so this sort of passing the buck as to who is going to actually put money into these funds was very prevalent in many of these conversations. And I just wanted to highlight someone that Fadel said about the fossil fuel industry being the largest country, if it were a country. In 2021 in Glasgow, there were 503 oil and gas lobbyists at COP. This year, there were, 636. So in 1 year, that's a really significant growth in that particular area of activity.
Out of how many
Those
people,
were
how
just
many people
registered
were
ones.
there on the ground?
I'm sorry.
How many people were in Egypt and how many people were in
Oh, on
Glasgow?
the ground total, in the blue zone or altogether? Guess,
Both.
Ian, I don't know if you know the number,
Altogether, the estimate I saw was over 40,000. We're
40,000.
expected to be in town for COP.
Got it.
Mix
So
of-
for each of you, Ian and Lina, what got done at COP? Like you're working it from at least the bottom up, but maybe the top down too. Like what got done? What would you say are beams of hope and green shoots of progress?
Well, what got done was this new fund was launched. It doesn't have any money in it yet, but it was launched, and there were some commitments from key countries, developed countries. So that's one thing. And then regarding Article 6 and a global carbon market, there was some progress made there, and trading is expected by 2024 through this new global carbon markets mechanism. So there were some further progress on 6.4, 6.8 without going into too much detail and getting too technical. There was some further clarity on some of the aspects of Article 6, which were long overdue.
And how about for you personally? Like, was it productive time to be there?
Very productive, in spite of some of the logistical challenges and stories that you may have heard about how difficult it was on the ground, spread out, as Ian mentioned, and difficult in many other ways. It was incredibly productive for us with this collaboration with the Africa Adaptation Initiative, furthering our collaboration with Kenya. I personally spoke on 3 panels, 2 in the innovation zone at the climate action stage on plastics. One was with Carbon Tracker and the Nature Conservancy. And so a lot of attention on plastics, not necessarily in the blue zone, but in the innovation zone, which was great to see. And that's a big part of our work. And then the third panel I did was with a wonderful organization called Leaders on Purpose. And it was a panel on the future of green jobs. And so that was, again, very much related topics. So it was very productive. We have a lot of new partnerships that have come out of it, collaborations, and new projects to work on as a result. So we are already planning for next year, and hopefully we'll have as productive of a year next year as we did this year.
Great. Yeah, sounds amazing. So glad that the venue could provide that chance to advance these positive initiatives. Ian, how about for you? How was it? And you're going to help us with a visual.
Yeah, I'll help you with a visual as I'm talking here. So this is just popping up what, in our view, is the most credible current climate solution model in terms of how fast things have to decarbonize. And you'll notice that oil, coal, and gas really have to go to zero. And then we need to be into net climate positive territory, aka carbon negative territory, where we're actually drawing out of the atmosphere more emissions than we're putting into the atmosphere. And that has to happen very quickly. Really, by close to 2050, we actually have to be close to net zero fossil fuels, and we have to be net zero in terms of emissions by 2040 as a planet at the latest to have a better than 50% chance of holding warming below 1.5 degrees. And it's important to note that 1.5 degrees warming is still a much worse world than we're already in terms of the climate impacts we're already experiencing. And as those of you who know me already know, my family here in California has been in the middle of one of these big wildfires, and for our community, in many ways, it's too late. We've already had our family, a couple dozen family members, hundreds of community members lose their homes overnight, and we're already seeing toxic air from wildfires all around the world, as well as crazy floods and all these other climate impacts, heat waves, killing more than actually anything else right now. So many, I think, would rightly.
And at 1.5 degrees Celsius, just want to give this one translation metaphor for everybody in the audience. 1.5 degrees Celsius is about 3 degrees, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. The Earth, imagine the Earth's temperature is your body temperature. If your body temperature were 3 degrees higher, 98.6, you'd have 102 fever all the time. So when we're talking about 101.5 degree world, we're talking about the Earth, like us, having 102 degree fever. And we're talking about 2 degrees or higher, we're talking about like 104 degree, 105 degree fever, which means you either have Ebola or you're dying. So this is mission critical. So Ian, walk us through like tangibly how we can get there.
Yeah, just to go even beyond that, Paul, it's not to get too far gloom and doom, but that's 1.5 degrees average around the planet, including most of the planet being ocean, which actually is absorbing a lot of heat. So it's actually warming much faster than the land. It's warming much faster than the Arctic. Already many places past that one.
Australia, I think, has just had a year where we're like 1.47 centigrade of warming is what we've effectively lived this year.
And Australia, of course, massive wildfires and then massive floods recently as well. So also experiencing extremes in both directions. So long story short, 1.5 degrees warming is not a target, it's a limit. And we're really trying to get warming down to effectively pre-industrial levels of zero warming, which requires about 280 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. And so that's the goal, right? Is we need to not just get to net zero, get beyond net zero to net climate positive, where we're moving more emissions and we're putting up in the atmosphere. And as that pollution is drawn down, eventually getting back to the healthy, stable climate that humans and every other species evolved with. So let's start by setting the targets in the right places. And that's where the Climate Positive Investing Alliance comes in, is we're trying to, at least from an investor perspective, set the targets where the science says it's necessary, align it with the most up-to-date climate models that say, as a planet, net zero by 2040, which really means investors need to move much faster than that to get portfolios beyond net zero to net climate positive before 2040. So for the Alliance, investors are signing on to 2035 at the very latest as a climate positive target, but most are going well beyond that. And again, fossil fuels just can't be part of the equation. So fossil fuel divestment is a requirement for everybody signing on to the Alliance, as well as overall upholding UN Sustainable Development Goals, Indigenous rights, diversity, equity, inclusion principles. And it's really just aligning with, again, what science says is necessary. And this is, for more on the Alliance, this is really for us what got done at COP27 was bringing together a global community to push targets for investors where they need to be, and then also support each other in doing the full climate accounting math, which includes scope 1, scope 2, and really essentially also scope 3 climate accounting that's looking not just at what directly is going on at a company's facilities that you're invested in, for example, but also what goes on in their supply chain and how the products and services they put out into the world actually also impact climate change, either for better or for worse. For example, scope 3 climate accounting makes an oil company's climate footprint look a lot worse, as it should be, because all of a sudden you then include all the climate footprint for the oil, gas, coal, any other fossil fuels a fossil fuel company is producing, which is kind of crazy. But the current status quo on climate accounting around investing and around company footprinting doesn't include any of the climate impacts related to the products and services companies put out there. So for your fossil fuel companies in the world right now, your Exxon, Chevrons, Saudi Aramcos, et cetera, all the climate pollution connected to the fuels they produce right now by default is not included in the climate footprint of those companies, which I think most of us would agree is crazy. So that scope 3 climate accounting,
it's like it's like using renewable energy to make nuclear bombs and obliterating the world and feeling like you've done a green good job.
Yeah, and that's probably, nuclear winter is not the way we want to solve climate change, is another side note to all this. So that
I do want to point out that the SEC, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, now has a new marketing rule for investment funds, and that came out at the beginning of November. And so for some of what you list here, Ian, there's mandatory disclosure for any fund calling itself ESG, environmental social governance, that they're going to have to report their greenhouse gases on the existing holdings. And so the good news is that there's that forced transparency coming soon. We're doing that with the HIP strategies and the HIP fossil-free portfolios. But there's a gap. One of the gaps is the reporting of companies. Well, it's increasing with CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, in Scope 1 and Scope 2. The Scope 3 that you're talking about, the carbon that comes out of the back of the car that lives for 100 years as carbon molecules, still there's not like defined enough science or frameworks. So, and Lina, you're working with this on the BVC Fund, and Ian, you're working on this with the Etho Capital Climate Leadership Index and ETF. So are there any mechanisms that have emerged to demand or force this transparency to then get the performance, to have this accountability?
Yeah, so it's really just about getting through the misinformation and mandating it. So that is what I was getting at. That was another outcome from actually the early days of COP27 that was great, is the UN Secretary General got up and announced this new UN report that provides guidance on net zero in terms of how both countries and companies should be thinking about net zero, which by extension also is how investors should be thinking about net zero. And the report makes it explicitly clear that Scope 3 is entirely essential. There's no way to get to net zero and beyond to net climate positive without Scope 3. And that's part of the message we've been putting out with the Climate Positive Investing Alliance, and certainly with what we've been doing with Etho Capital and beyond net zero to climate positive investing as well. So there's now increasingly at the international level recognition that Scope 3 is entirely necessary. Europe is moving in the direction of mandating Scope 3. There's a lot of industry lobbying against Scope 3, putting out misinformation that it's too hard to do, there aren't standards, it's undoable. Quite frankly, that's entirely BS. It's put out, that misinformation is put out there because of vested interests that don't want to see this data mandated. The fossil fuel industry obviously doesn't, because their carbon footprint goes up by a lot when you include the emissions incorporated in the fuels they're selling. For example, for Exxon, based on the calculations we do for Scope 1, 2, and 3 accounting at Etho Capital, which covers about 10,000 of the most commonly traded companies in the world, Exxon has about 6 times worse climate footprint when you include Scope 3. And I wasn't actually planning to share this slide, but I can pop up one to just add some visuals in there. So this is looking at just Scope 1 and 2 emissions for Exxon versus Vestas, the wind company. And so Scope 3 actually both can illuminate increased impacts for companies, but it also can illuminate which companies are actually net climate positive, which companies have more benefit for every dollar invested in them than the impacts it takes to produce the products and services that are climate solution related that they produce. So for example, for Exxon, as mentioned, when you add the Scope 3 calculations, both the upstream supply chain and actually for Exxon, more importantly, the downstream emissions from burning their fuels, Scope 3 makes their climate footprint about 6 times worse than it currently is with status quo emissions calculations, just Scope 1 and Scope 2. For Vestas, a wind energy company, it actually comes out as a net climate positive company when you add in the full, not just upstream supply chain Scope 3, but also downstream Scope 3 calculations for the climate benefits for investing $1 in creating wind turbines effectively that are reducing emissions versus a baseline status quo grid emissions intensity calculation. So without Scope 3,
just to get everybody up to date, so just to make sure everybody is up to date in the audience, because it's not technical to all of us here on the panel, but Scope 1 is the emissions from inside your company boundaries. Scope 2 is the energy purchases you're bringing in via utilities or the like. And then Scope 3 is both the supply chain and the customer chain. And so it's both upstream, several tiers up the chain. So if you had a pair of jeans, it includes the way the cotton is grown, or if you eat a cup of yogurt, it includes what the cows eat, whether it's grass or corn. And the customer chain is what happens to the product once it's in the environment. Lina, COP is, we've talked a lot about energy and carbon emissions, but There's also impact on oceans, which is another one of your focuses, right? So was there progress on oceans at COP27?
I'm not sure that there was in the official negotiations. There were a lot of other activities around COP in the innovation zone and in the green zone and so on around oceans and plastic specifically. There's a post-COP, the plastics treaty. Then there are some really interesting outcomes from the human rights treaty that have implications now if, let's say, plastics toxicity can be linked to, for example, fertility, which is considered a human right, or clean water, which is again considered a human right. That opens up the ability for litigation, or it presents a risk for companies to now be held accountable via this mechanism of human rights for their impacts around, let's say, plastics production, for example. So there are some interesting outcomes from those conversations. One of the other ones that's wasn't directly COP related, but certainly thematically connected, is the CBAM legislation in Europe, which stands for carbon border adjustment mechanisms, meaning if you are producing as a company in a certain country and offsetting for a lower price, that you would have to adjust for the price of carbon in the country where you are engaging in commerce. So there are a lot of related, interesting conversations and activities that will have an impact on the conversations we'll be having at the next COP in Dubai.
And when is that? When is the next one?
I believe it's the 1st of the 12th of December, if I remember correctly. It's a little bit later than it was this year. I believe it's sometime early to mid-December.
And question from the audience, is it best to have these annually, every other year, twice a year? Like, what's the right cadence?
Well, the COP, the main COP that we're talking about is only one of many meetings that happen within the UNFCCC and broader UN structures. I think it was Nigel mentioned COP15, which is the biodiversity COP that just happened in Montreal. There are many other thematic and specific gatherings throughout the year. So is it enough? If you look at the outcomes and the urgency around them, perhaps not. If we look at the productivity of them, perhaps they're not achieving as much as we would all like to see. In fact, this COP was dubbed as the implementation COP, and many would say that it did not live up to its name. So I guess that's up for debate. Is it too much or not enough?
Great. Wow, time flies even when we're solving the world's problems, including climate. So as we start to wrap up, Lina, you run Innovation 4.4, which refers to the innovation over 4 billion years of history. You run the BVC Fund. You're doing lots of work across you two. Ian and Lina are two of my favorite multi-sector people, in addition to Fadl and Nigel, working across business and nonprofit and governments in a multi-sector way. So, and then Ian, you're running Etho Capital, you're lecturing at Stanford, you have the Etho ETF, ticker ETHO. So what, for the audience, how can they get involved? Like what should anyone listening to this, which will replay on YouTube and on ESGX.org, what should people do to personally and with a multiplier effect?
Well, when I usually give talks at conferences, I always end by saying you can invest better, you can purchase better, you can vote better, and you can educate others. Everyone can do at least one and hopefully a few of those things. And wherever you start is the right place to start. And just be curious and keep learning and finding new ways to be useful and do better.
Very well said.
Great.
And I'll just chime in how one way to invest better, and I'll give a shameless plug to Paul and what HIP Investor is doing as well, is check out what HIP is up to. And for what we're doing with the public equity side of climate solution investing, ethocapital.com has a lot more info on how individuals can get to climate positive investments. And more broadly, for anybody, not just even in the investing community, but really trying to help move money out of climate problems into solutions at the pace that the science says is necessary and in line with the full climate accounting, including scope 3 analysis that also the science says is necessary, while upholding other important issues like UN Sustainable Development Goals, Indigenous rights, and we did a lot of work with Indigenous leaders at COP27, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice principles. Check out what we're doing with the Climate Positive Investing Alliance. It's just positiveclimate.org, and it's open both to institutions, including not just investors, but we have a lot of nonprofit partners, including ones doing sustainable ocean work, like the Sustainable Oceans Alliance, Intentional Endowments Network, One Earth, which spun out of DiCaprio Foundation, and a number of other great nonprofits that are really realizing that they need to support this bigger push of money out of problems into solutions. And we're hoping that the next COP, even though it's going to be in the heart of the oil industry, we can advance a lot on the dialogue of really funding this loss and damage fund, hopefully extending it to everyone who's suffering from climate change already, as well as climate solutions, and funding that with defunding the fossil fuel industry at the same time, because I think there is really a synergy between loss and damage and all the funding necessary to pay for the problems that are already being suffered can actually come from the fossil fuel industry. And there's more or less the amount of money that we need to transition to a fully decarbonized world is pretty close to the amount that we're currently spending on fossil fuels right now, not just through subsidies, but just how much we're spending on oil and gas and coal every year. So it's very doable. It's really just about getting beyond the vested interests, getting beyond the misinformation, working together, those of us who are really trying to do it. And whether or not having a COP every year is necessary, I'm still on the fence, because honestly, getting folks from all over the world to get on planes, burn a bunch of carbon to go to a given location and talk about solving climate change, there's certainly a lot of problems and hypocrisy with that. And that's part of the reason I've only done 2 COPs in my lifetime, despite being in climate solutions my entire life. With that said, COPs are this amazing conglomeration of tens of thousands of climate champions from around the world. Some are there as corporate greenwashers and government greenwashers, but many are there really seriously trying to do this stuff. So that opportunity to be in the same place with climate champions from around the world is pretty unparalleled. And so I really came away from this COP feeling even much more energized than I expected, not just because of how the Climate Positive Investing Alliance has grown, but just having that community, feeling like there are a lot of great people around the world really trying to push things. And I think that's going to continue. So I'm a fan of COPs happening for that reason. It would be great if we could figure out how to make them be lower carbon, but just bringing everybody from around the world together into one place physically. I'm not sure how to do it without a bunch of hyperloops and electric planes. So hopefully we'll get there too.
All right, well, coming soon. Thanks so much for investing your time in making the world better, in making the world cleaner, energy and oceans. Really appreciate your multi-sector leadership across business and nonprofits and government and academia. It's super helpful to know where you shop, where you work, how you invest, including your 401k, and how you vote. So hopefully everybody got a sense that you can take action in your own life in your own portfolio. And you can create multiplier effects either by collaborating with Lina's organizations and Ian's organizations, connecting with them on LinkedIn. There's a lot of work to do. There's no lack of work for all of us to do. On behalf of everybody, Lina Constantinovici of Innovation 4.4 and BVC Fund, Ian Monroe of Etho Capital and the Etho ETF, Amir Khalegi, soon to be a PhD next summer, HIP investor and the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and Dr. Fadel Kaboub at Denison University, professor and president of Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. I'm Paul Herman, based in France currently, and back to you, Nigel, for the wrap up. And thanks to Nick Gower, our producer, for bringing it all together. Over to you, Nigel.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul. I think a wonderful way to end ESGX Live for this year. I think I have two words for everybody, and they are collaborative action. We know what needs to be done. Some of it is quite easy, some of it is quite hard, and this is very much a team sport. For those running businesses or in finance that are still looking at the profits they're making on coal and thinking that world will continue, it won't. The future is coming at us really, really fast, and we see this in all sorts of industries where the solutions are already more economic or fast becoming more economic. And if you don't have a plan to transition, then you're going to get crushed by the change. And that will be tough for you and great for the people that are bringing it. This is, of course, not just about climate change, as we've talked about today. There is the whole issue of environment in our food supply chains, and that's what COP15 was about, and we will be coming back to those topics in the new year. And of course, it's all about people and doing this in an inclusive way, and we've seen the threats of rising dissatisfaction in societies around the world and what that can do to politics, and we must all be doing everything we can, including casting our vote, as Lina so rightly said, to drive those changes. So thanks. I want to add my thanks to Nick, who fixes all sorts of little glitches which happen behind the scenes. You wouldn't believe how frequently between the various platforms the settings or options change and things work differently with no notice. But it's been wonderful to have all of our guests today, and indeed every episode this year, and in all of our nearly 80 episodes of ESGX Live. So thank you all very much for joining us, and we will be back in 2023.
Happy New Year. Happy holidays.
New Year.